Okay, so today's notes are on completing the square. It's lesson 6 and it's section 4.6 in your book. Our objective is to solve equations and rewrite equations by completing the square, and the language objective is to use the correct terminology to describe that process. We're going to start with an example on solving a quadratic equation such as this, where we can solve using square roots, which is why we reviewed that in our last lesson. So to solve this using square roots, we're going to start by isolating x squared. So to do that, I'm first going to subtract my 10 from both sides, and I get 4x squared is equal to 36. Then I keep going, I take or divide both sides by 4, and I get x squared is equal to 9. So my last step after I isolate x squared is to take the square root of both sides. And when we do that, the square root on the left side cancels, and I get x is equal to plus or minus 3. So one key thing when we're solving, or when we solve out a quadratic by square rooting or taking the square root aside, is we need to remember to have both a positive and negative solution. So I'm going to put a little note here because this is a key point. So note your solution can be positive or negative because negative 3 times negative 3 is equal to positive 9, and positive 3 times positive 3 is equal to 9. So whether negative 3 squared is the same as positive 3 squared, so when you take the square root, it could be either solution, the positive or negative version of that value. So we're going to do a couple quick checks just to make sure you guys are okay solving these kinds of problems out. So here's your first one. I want you to solve 3x squared minus 5 equals 25, and then try out 7x squared minus 10 equals 25. So try those each on your own really quickly. Pause it if you need to. I'm going to go over it now. So we start by moving the 5 to the other side. So I have 3x squared equals 30. I divide both sides by 3, and I get x squared is equal to 10. And then I square root both sides, and I get x is equal to positive or negative square root of 10. That can't be simplified, so since I don't want to write out an irrational number, I'd rather leave it as a square root than writing a rounded decimal or truncated decimal. So I'd rather just leave it like this as my final answer. So if we go on to the next example, I add 10 to both sides, and I get 7x squared is equal to 35. I divide both sides by 7, and then I get x squared is equal to 5. I take the square root of both sides, and I get x is equal to plus or minus square root of 5. And that will be my final answer there. All right, jot down any questions on that. I'm going to turn the page to go over another example, sort of the next step in the process. So our next example, I want us to solve x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 25. So some of you, if we put this 25 to the side for a moment, some of you might remember from our factoring unit, a perfect square trinomial is when you take the square root of the first term and the last term, double it, and if it equals the middle term, then you can split it into a perfect square trinomial of x plus 2 squared. So if you didn't remember that, you square root the first term, it is x, you square root the last term, it's 2, and since the middle term is double their product, or double when I multiply those, I know it can be simplified or factored to a perfect square. So I have x plus 2 squared equals 25. The reason I bring this up is because we're going to be developing or creating perfect square trinomials today as we complete the squares so that we can continue solving with this process. So the first step when we have a perfect square trinomial is to recognize it. So we need to recognize our perfect square trinomial and then factor. And now even though it's 25 on the other side, I can solve it by taking the square root of both sides. So I square root this side and I square root this side, and I end up with x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 5. So then I'm going to solve out for my final two solutions. So I have x plus 2 is equal to positive 5, or x plus 2 is equal to negative 5. When I subtract 2 on the first equation, I get x is equal to 3. And the second equation, I get x is equal to negative 7. So my two solutions for this quadratic equation will be x equals 3 and x equals negative 7. So the reason we're talking about this is because we're going to, as I mentioned, develop perfect square trinomials so that we can end up solving out equations. So our next example, I want us to determine what is the solution of 3x squared minus 12x plus 6 equals 0. So I want us to solve this quadratic equation for our x values. So to do this, we're going to first, step 1, move c. Since this is standard form, I'm going to move my c value to the other side of the equation. So when I do that, I end up getting 3x squared minus 12x equals negative 6. So the next step, I need to determine, to make this a perfect square trinomial, I know that, well, first I need to get rid of my a value. So sorry, step 2, I need to divide or get a to equal 1 by dividing both sides by a, or the current a value. In this case, it's going to be 3. So I'm going to divide all these parts by 3, so I get an a value of 1, which leaves me with x squared minus 4x equals negative 2. So now this is my new equation. I've gotten a to equal 1. So I want to make a perfect square trinomial like the one we had in our last example. And to do that, as I mentioned before, I want to have a and c value that when doubled gives me my b value. So the way we can do this is by doing b over 2 squared. So if I determine the value of b over 2 squared and add it onto the end of this equation, I'll have created a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to use b over 2 squared. So that will be my next step. So b over 2 squared, which in this instance will be negative 4 over 2 squared, which is negative 2 squared, which is 4. So I calculated my b over 2 squared value, and then I'm going to add that to both sides. And when I do that, I get x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals negative 2 plus 4. So now I'm just going to factor this perfect square trinomial in the same way I just factored my last perfect square trinomial. So 5, I'm going to factor, and I get x minus 2, since this is subtracted, I know it's going to be minus 2 squared equals 2. Then all I need to do is solve for x like we just solved in our last instance. So I'm going to solve for x. So I square root both sides, and I get x minus 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 2. So x minus 2 is equal to the square root of 2, or x minus 2 is equal to the negative square root of 2. I add 2 to both sides, and I get x is equal to 2 plus the square root of 2, or x is equal to 2 minus the square root of 2. You can also simply write that as x is equal to 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. if you prefer to keep it concise. But that's how we're going to solve those problems out. We'll go over some more together in class, but make sure you write down any questions, comments, concerns you have on any of these notes.